Welcome to La Excellence's series called Perspectives. What we want to do in this series of videos is to actually build perspective on various questions that appear in the UPSC examination, especially in the general essay section, but also are just important issues that we need to understand and discuss and process in contemporary India. So what we aim to do in these videos is to offer a perspective on important issues that are part of the public domain and part of the public debate in India, and help you build perspective, because if you look at the general essay questions, they demand that you take a position. They demand that you think about a certain issue. They are not purely information-based questions. They don't demand expository answers where you simply explain what so-and-so is, but they ask you to take a position. They ask you to think about a question and defend that position in the rest of your answer. So to be able to take a position and to be able to defend it, you have to understand it. And what we aim to do in these videos, in the Perspectives series, is to help you build understanding of issues. What I want to do today is to talk about three judgments that are part of now the public debate around Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code, and issues around homosexuality, issues around right of privacy, because the recent right of privacy judgment invokes the NAS judgment around Section 377 and criticizes the Kaushal judgment of the Supreme Court of 2012, saying that basically that judgment is untenable in the right to privacy lens, or from that perspective. And we will do another video on the right to privacy in relation to the UID or the Aadhaar judgment, which is another very important topic that you might well get a question on in the general essay section of the UPSC. But for the moment today, we're just going to look at these three judgments that deal with homosexuality, and those are the NAS judgment of 2009, the Kaushal judgment of 2012, and the Null So judgment of 2013. Let's start with the NAS judgment. So the debate around the repeal of Section 377 really began in the 90s in Delhi, for example, with a group called ABVA, the AIDS Bhedbhav Virodhi Andholan, which did a lot of work around HIV and AIDS and called for a repeal, I repeat, a repeal of Section 377. This suddenly changed in the early 2000s with the court case being filed by NAS Foundation, which is an NGO, and I'll talk a little about NGOs in a minute. But it turned into a case for the reading down of Section 377, not the repeal. So the famous NAS judgment that everyone lauds is actually not, as is popularly conceived, about the decriminalization of homosexuality, such as it is in Section 377, because Section 377 doesn't actually mention homosexuality, doesn't use the word. But what the point I'm trying to make is that this was no longer a repeal, a call for the repeal of the act, but simply a reading down of it, and a reading down to just exclude private consensual sex between adults. And we'll come to that in a minute. But the point about NGOs, which is the second point I want to make, is that NGOs are another phenomenon that we need to spend another video in this perspective series building an understanding of. But this is largely, again, a phenomenon that really boomed in the 90s, post-LPG. And we have to look at the politics of NGOs, where they come from, what they are doing, who's funding them. If research and what we look at in terms of funding is important, for example, pharmaceutical companies funding science research that then tell us that certain drugs are useful and certain others are not, then we must also pay attention to the politics of NGOs. And NGOs have a certain global agenda. Usually the funding is from the rich Western countries of the global North. And this funding is for countries in the global south around issues like HIV and AIDS. Indeed, the so-called LGBT movement that we have, such as it is, I don't even think it's a movement at all, really came out of this global awareness and funding and aid around HIV AIDS. So the LGBT movement piggybacked on the HIV AIDS movement, and that's how it comes into India, which is itself in some sense a problem, and that problem gets reflected in the Null judgment when one of the main arguments that they're using is that 377 should be read down, and I don't know how the reading down is going to affect this, but they say the reading down will reduce risk of HIV and will work with communities that are marginalized around HIV. I don't see the connection between the right to privacy and safety around HIV and AIDS, but never mind, we'll keep that debate for a little later. For the moment, this NGO files the case. It's the calling for the reading down, not the repeal. And if you look at the judgment is full of problems. We celebrate this judgment without thinking at all, but actually this judgment is full of problems. One of the big overriding problems, I can't deal with that 125-page judgment in great detail in this video, but I'm going to deal with the large points. So one of the big points that is a problem for me in this judgment is this march towards modernity in the judgment, that India is asked to catch up with the West, that the 21st century, most countries, most civilized countries have repealed laws against homosexuality and sodomy, so why shouldn't India catch up? It's the march towards modernity. And my point is, this is a very racist and colonialist idea, especially for another part of the judgment that it contradicts, where it says that we had a great setup here around homosexuality, but the British came and in some sense brought their Judeo-Christian ideas of sexuality and imposed them on our social landscape. And this seems to me absurd. So if the British came and imposed their Judeo-Christian ideology, whatever that is, historically this category itself is a bit strange, we'll come to that in a bit. But if they came and did this, why are we marching towards them yet again? We are going towards the West. You're saying let's become like the West because the West has these rights and we have to follow. So I don't understand this evolutionary civilizational narrative. Why can't the point be that we have same-sex cultures which are quite different from those in the West, and we need to really understand those cultures and build structures of support, build laws, build understanding around those structures rather than this unilinear, singular, monolithic march towards modernity, towards Western modernity. The next question is really that of privacy, which is that if the main plank of the Null judgment is privacy, I want to make 2 points. One is that privacy is a matter of class and caste. If I can own a bedroom and I can own a house or I can rent a house and I have my own bedroom, I can afford privacy. But as if I'm living on the streets, I don't have privacy. And so the idea of demanding the protection of people who are already protected by private property or by access to private property seems to me a bit strange, because if you already have access to private property, you already have privacy. Why does the law need to give you that privacy? And 2, there are communities among the LGBT who don't have that privacy, principally Hijras. Hijras have to perform most of their lives on the streets, either begging or in sex work. And that is public activity with no safety. And the Null judgment doesn't cover them at all. It invokes them to pretend that it's working for them, to pretend that they are talking about them and their marginalization, but actually they have nothing to do with privacy. And I don't think that they live in communities, first of all, not in private homes. And secondly, most of their activity, as I've just said, is on the streets, and we have to protect them on the streets and not in the privacy of bedrooms or rooms. So that's the privacy argument. Next is the constitutional argument in some sense, which is that they invoke the fundamental rights within the Constitution Article 15, Article 21, and so on and so forth. Whereas Article 15 really talks about sex and not about sexual orientation. And you can't really interpret sex to mean sexual orientation. These are quite different things. Sex is biological sex. Sexual orientation is the kind of person you desire. And unless the Constitution and unless the country as a whole understands sexual orientation as a right, you really can't collapse sex into sexual orientation, which is what this judgment attempts to do. The next point is coming back to an earlier point I invoked, which is about HIV/AIDS. That is, if you are going to build your case for homosexual rights in this country on the HIV/AIDS bandwagon, that's a bit problematic on several counts. The first count is that most of HIV/AIDS victims are not in fact LGBT people at all. They are women, largely what we could classify as heterosexual women, including sex workers, including housewives who are infected by husbands, who are in their travels contracting HIV and AIDS. And there's wonderful work done by various organizations like the South India AIDS Action Program, SIAP, that actually has tracked this for the last 30 years. So we know that most HIV/AIDS patients or people that we need to work with or groups are in fact not LGBT at all, just in terms of pure percentages, and we can get the statistics on this. And that's one. Second is that if you're going to build your notion of identity politics around a disease, around an infection, that's really unfortunate, because you really are already pathologizing in some sense. You're making this group into a group linked to disease and epidemiology rather than identity. And the real fight should be around identity. And the last point is, in some sense, again, theoretical and about the Constitution, which is that the judgment makes a lot about something called constitutional morality. It invokes Ambedkar. It says we should uphold constitutional morality instead of public morality. And this seems to me both a very naive and abstract reading of the Constitution and a very pathetic appropriation of Ambedkar. Because if you remember, Ambedkar on the Constitution clearly says that the Constitution means nothing. It is only the topsoil, he says. And actually the deep roots of society are deeply undemocratic in India, and we need to change those deep roots, and just sprinkling the Constitution on the topsoil is not going to change anything. So actually this dichotomy between public morality and constitutional morality is in some sense an empty one. We can invoke constitutional morality in every possible judgment, but that's not how the social structures work. So we actually need an engagement with public morality, and we need to change public morality. And public morality isn't one thing. It is many things. It is a contested space, and the real struggle for LGBT rights is to engage with that contested space and change it so that societies recognize here that there is something called LGBT, that there is something called same-sex cultures. Even if we don't want to call it LGBT, we might want to call it something else, because terminology is also important, and I think we will come to terminology when we look at the third judgment, which is the Null So Judgment, where terminology becomes, as I will argue, a key issue. So that's the Nas judgment, 377, which we laud as a great judgment. By contrast, we are deeply critical, the media is almost universally critical, of the Kaushal Supreme Court of India judgment. Nas judgment was a Delhi High Court judgment, really applicable only to Delhi. This is a Supreme Court judgment that read down, or that struck down, the Nas judgment. It invalidated it in 2012, and it is seen as a terrible judgment, as a very bad judgment, but actually it is not that bad a judgment. It is actually quite a useful and productive judgment on many counts, and I will proceed to argue how and why. First is that it makes the very important point that it is not the jurisdiction of the judiciary to talk about constitutional amendments, and I think this is a good point. This is judicial overreach. The Nas judgment had no business talking about the Constitution and changing identity politics around the Constitution, changing categories in the Constitution, changing ideas of how we think about polity at all, because that is not the point of the judiciary. So that's the first point that Kaushal makes. The second important point it makes is that 377 doesn't criminalize any identities. It criminalizes acts, activities. These activities are seen as criminal by a very conservative Christian understanding of the world. But we'll come to that in a minute. The point is that it is not about identities. So actually, to even graft the whole LGBT movement, such as it is, onto Section 377 is a bit strange, because Section 377 doesn't actually, as I said, even use the word homosexual. It just talks about acts. Now, what are these acts that 377 criminalizes? And here the Kaushal judgment shows you its deep conservatism. But I want to argue that even its conservatism is actually quite productive, quite useful. And I'll come to that in a minute. But what are these unnatural acts? So basically, these unnatural acts are anything that doesn't lead to procreative sex. So reproductive sex. So actually, kissing is an unnatural act according to Section 377, strictly speaking. Oral sex of any kind, whether heterosexual or homosexual or bisexual or whatever sexual, is criminal under Section 377. So this is a deeply absurd Christian law that we have simply adopted hook, line and sinker. And Kaushal and his reading of various Indian judgments, and the other point he makes is that Nas invokes mainly foreign judgments, and this seems absurd, and I think it is absurd. And he invokes mainly Indian judgments, which is far more useful. And if you look at his analysis of various judgments, you will see that it's a deeply conservative sexual vision. But again, that deeply conservative sexual vision is what we need to engage with. We can't make fun of it. We can't mock it. Everyone has been mocking the Kaushal judgment. There's a play now by Danish Sheikh about how stupid this judgment is, and I find this useless, this kind of work, because actually this conservatism is what we have to deal with and what we have to engage with. So for example, there are interesting ethnographic moments from the Kaushal judgment, where apparently one of the sources given to him was the Ruth Vanitha and Salim Kidwai edited book, Same-Sex Love in India, where he read a story, a beautiful story by the Rajasthani writer Vijay Dandeta about a lesbian affair between two women. And he came back to the court and he said, this is a story about love, it's not about sex. And this is the kind of conservatism that we have to deal with. And instead of actually playing to that and said, yes, we are talking about love and not about sex, which of course is not what we are doing, but it's a strategic thing to do in court. Instead, the lawyers took the high ground and actually stood by some absurd idea of the constitutionality of homosexuality, or whatever you want to call it. So my point is that it is a conservative judgment, but it is a fruitful judgment. It opens up the debate around conservative ideas of what constitutes sex and sexuality. And I think this judgment is something we can work with, as opposed to Nas. It doesn't have the rhetorical flights of fancy of Nas. It actually is located in the Indian contexts and is therefore a much more useful judgment to work with, to see the sexual conservatism at the heart of our public morality and to change it. To think that kissing is unnatural, for example, is utterly absurd, and we have to change that way of thinking. Finally, we come to the Null So judgment of 2013. What is the Null So judgment? What does Null So even mean? It's the National Legal Services Authority versus the Union of India. And what is the National Legal Services Authority? This was set up to offer legal services to marginalized people by the Legal Services Authority Act of 1997. So what are these guys trying to argue in this judgment? They are trying to say that we need to give rights to Hijras. Now, this is brilliant. We need to give rights to Hijras because, in fact, Hijras are the most marginalized people in India. But they use the term transgender. Now, transgender is a term from the United States that actually has a particular historical origin and trajectory, and Hijras have really nothing to do with the word transgender. Indeed, the definition of Hijra given in this judgment is in fact, the US definition of transgender, judgments, court judgments, like much else in this country, are really cut and paste jobs from Wikipedia. It's really unfortunate that this is the state of legal writing in India, but this is what happens. And so they really take that transgender definition from the internet and they put it in this judgment, and that's how they define transgender. And A, that's not hijra, but also B, that leads to a certain conceptual confusion about whom we are talking about. Whom are we talking about in this judgment? Are we talking about queer people? Are we talking about gender queer people? Are we talking about gender non-conforming people? We are not, actually. We are talking about hijras. And so the very use of the word transgender is a problem that we need to think about in relation to this judgment. The judgment also really follows the same route as Nas, making the arguments from the Yogacarta principles, from the UN, from American discourse around transgender rights. This is really how it builds itself, and it actually ignores all the realities of life around hijras. Hijras are a complicated social category in India. They're a complicated political category. Many of them have stood for elections, won the elections, been disqualified because they wrote their gender as women, have fought back. Many states now have a category called third gender, like the Aravanis in Tamil Nadu. In fact, the state of Tamil Nadu actually has an Aravani welfare board set up by the state, dysfunctional at the moment, but set up by the DMK. And we need to really follow that model to build rights to ration cards, rights to pensions, rights to shelter for third gender people, for hijras in this country. And nowhere does this judgment engage with that history. It doesn't really engage with the history of hijra politics in India and how they lost patronage and how they became the marginalized communities they are. They do not engage with the hijra engagement with crime, with the hijra engagement with a lot of political and in some sense social appropriation, but also violence. It's really, and I mean violence from hijras, not necessarily violence on hijras, but the bill really is the worst, which is that the bill that comes out of this judgment has been hijacked by a new group, a new pressure group in Indian society, which are trans. They are called the trans group. Now they are largely upper caste, upper class, English speaking, foreign educated people, clearly influenced by the US discourse on trans, and they have hijacked the debates around the bill. And hijras are no longer part of this. They don't really have access very often to literacy, let alone to fighting complex judicial battles, let alone fighting the media or creating awareness around struggles. So hijras are marginalized in a judgment about them, and it's taken over by upper caste, upper class trans people who are coming from a very different perspective of trans rights in the United States. So this is the condition of LGBT rights through these three judgments that I've talked about in brevity, not in great detail, but you should read these three judgments to understand any question that you will get in the UPSC about identity politics. And there are many questions about identity politics, both in relation to general studies, also the general essay, and in your optional, if you're doing something like sociology or you're doing anthropology, hijras, there's been anthropological studies of hijras, and they're different, very different kinship patterns, they're very different social understandings of the world, they're different rituals, there's syncretic religious syncretism. So there are actually these questions around sexuality, around identity, across all three domains. It also is relevant to the question of privacy. We'll do another video on how the right to privacy judgment around UID Aadhaar invokes Nas and criticizes Kaushal, and I have a problem with that invocation of privacy as well, not least linked to the points I've already made about privacy, but there are many more critiques of the idea of privacy as being the foundation of a judgment and the foundation of the protection of the citizen. It's a bit of a problem for me to think about it in relation to privacy, which is, after all, a bourgeois concept that actually does not recognize caste, it does not recognize class, it does not recognize gender, it does not recognize many things that we need to think about. So this was our first video on perspectives. I hope you enjoyed it. We will bring you many videos dealing with all the important issues of our times, so you can help build perspective for your UPSC answers. Thank you.